We will start soon. Okay. So if you can please take your seats. And you need your headphones. But how do... Okay, we are starting. So welcome everybody to the most exciting side event of Stockholm+50. It's almost the end of the day. And we are starting the side event on to listen to me, because we're in a very innovative mode of silent listening. So we all need to wear the headphones, and then you will be able to hear us. Right. So welcome again. We are starting the side event on sustainable living within 1.5 degrees, innovative pathways to live better and lighter. And as I say, this is going to be fun and very interesting. Why? Because it is related to you, to us, on how we live our everyday life. Before we start, on behalf of UNEP, Cool Institute and GO4SDGs, we want to thank you all to be here. We are very happy. And really, I'm very happy to be celebrating Stockholm+50. As we say, this is a time to reflect and a time for action. We are talking about the 5 R's, and they are not the 5 R's for recycling, but Stockholm+50 is inviting us on how are we going to do regeneration of our ecosystems? How are we going to ensure the recovery in a way that is sustainable and inclusive? How are we going to rebalance our societies and economies to reduce inequalities? How are we going to restore trust, restore the existing commitments? We don't need more commitments. And the 5, rather action, and the 5 are very important to this session is reimagine. How do we reimagine that future? How can we reshape this society? So this is the key theme. And before that, let me also go back 50 years ago, 72, Stockholm, 1972. We were sitting, well, we know, but our own generation were sitting here discussing about important issues. And I just want to read one beautiful part of the declaration in 72 that says, we have reached a point in history when we must shape our actions through the world with more prudent care. With ignorance or indifference, we can do massive and irreversible harm to the environment on which our life and well-being depend. And I think it's beautiful, and I think it could have been written yesterday, but we didn't hear that. And sadly, the situation we are living today is not different, except that the magnitude of the problem is bigger. And now we are facing this triple planetary crisis that we are talking about with climate, biodiversity, pollution. So we need to rethink, what is missing, what we didn't do. That's one. 72 was also very important. If you look at the speeches, in particular from Indira Gandhi, 72 started the debate where we were talking about consumption or population. And that was like, what is the issue? Population is the main driver for environmental discussion until some countries say, no, it is the level of consumption. And again, because I was looking at the speeches in 72, let me read this from Indira Gandhi. She said, we are to focus on a single dimension model of development, and let me go there, that has given higher place to things rather than to people, and has increased the wants rather than the enjoyment. Obsolescence obsolescence is built in production, and efficiency is based on production of goods which are not really needed and cannot be disposed. So 72, this was in the core of the discussion. So we are here again to say, okay, now really, how are we going to change this? And with that, without further ado, we will start. And sorry, I didn't introduce myself. My name is Adriana Zacarias Fara. I work in UNEP. I'm leading a global initiative called Global Opportunities for Sustainable Development Goals. It's an accelerator of the SDGs, and in particular SDG 12 on sustainable consumption and production, and SDG 8 on green growth. So the idea is, how can we really accelerate and connect the dots? So we are working with different partners, and is funded by the German Ministry of Environment. So I'm very pleased to be here. I will be your moderator today. We have an excellent panel that actually will be telling us what they are doing in scaling up and doing this transition to more sustainability. So without further ado, I want to introduce now our keynote speaker, Luisa Kenji, Managing Director of Hot and Cool Institute, a very dear friend of mine, and someone that is also very passionate about promoting sustainable lifestyles, and an author of a very important publication on sustainable living on the 1.5 degrees. He's going to give a presentation, and later I will introduce our fantastic panelists. So please, Luis.
Right.
And I forgot to mention, I want to welcome everybody who is also joining us in the virtual world. This side event is being live streamed, so we also have a lot of people around the world joining us here. So Luis, the floor is yours.
Thank you so very much. I hope you can silently hear me. It's wonderful to see you all. As Adriana was reading this, I was thinking, it's 50 years. It's not only 50 years since the UN gathered here, it's also 50 years since the report called The Limits to Growth, which questioned our consumption, especially our hyperconsumption. And what we've done, one of the biggest failures over this last 50 years, is we've carefully shifted that question of consumption and our lifestyles out of the policy process and how to address this problem. Thankfully, that is changing, and we're talking about lifestyles and consumption now. But we're probably not addressing it also, which is what I'm going to show you. The way we're talking about it does not also recognize the intricacies. So what I'm going to do in the next few minutes is to tell you at least two things. That one, we're not going to be able to solve the climate change problem if we do not address our lifestyles, especially the issue of overconsumption and inequality. And what I'd also like to tell or show is that most of the approaches and the assumptions that we've made in how we address this problem have been actually faulty, and they've actually entrenched part of the problem instead of addressing it. So here we are. And a very quick summary of what the problem is, where we are today. Three tensions within sustainability. The first one is we are increasing production, and at the same time, the resources upon which we depend are diminishing. The second one is we have rising poverty, and at the same time, we have rising consumerism. The third one here, which is at the other end, is that we have increasing waste, but the sinks that can absorb this, the capacity of the earth to absorb this, is very limited. So where do we go? This is why the Cool Institute asked the question of how we put people and science at the very center of the sustainability transition. That is most of the work we do. That's why we recently published a report on enabling sustainable lifestyles in a climate emergency together with the United Nations Environment Program. That's why we have, for the first time, one chapter in this annual foresight report that is dedicated to behavior change. That is how we have publications that are actually pushing the boundary of what we understand and how to address this issue in a climate emergency. Some of our work has actually been covered very extensively in the Times, by the BBC, by CBC News in Canada, on primetime TV, and lots of mainstream media, which you will see. So there's a lot of interest growing here, but I think governments have still not caught on to this. And I would argue businesses have not caught on to this, and they're going to get left behind because so much social tension is building behind this climate problem, and we're not looking at it very clearly. Where is that tension? Usually when you look at diagrams on, or graphs on pollution, this is what you typically see. China so big, the US, and so on. This is true, but this is also true that if you address it from a consumption perspective, the same information suddenly looks very different. So if you look at it from a perspective of individual consumption of resources in these countries, it's quite different. So consumption-based accounting, right? This is why we did the 1.5-degree lifestyles, to ask a question on how changes in lifestyles can contribute to the Paris Agreement, to the 1.5-degree target. And we analyzed 10 countries, as you can see here on the screen. Among those 10 countries, we looked at lifestyle carbon footprints. So footprints from what you eat, how you travel from place to place, housing, and leisure, and consumer goods. And you can already see the hotspots there from the various domains that I've listed. And if you analyze the budget that the IPCC has given us, that is left for us in terms of greenhouse gas emissions before we cross the 1.5 threshold, this is where we need to be by 2030. And this is how much we need to reduce greenhouse gas emissions from our lifestyles and consumption by 2050. Keep in mind, we're currently at a lifestyle carbon footprint of about 4.6 tons per person per year, CO2 equivalent, as a global average. This is how much so many countries need to reduce within the next 7, 8 years if we're to be on track to meet those goals. And this is how much we need to reduce by 2050. What this already tells you is the magnitude of the challenge and the urgency of what we're talking about when we look at this problem from a consumption-based perspective. But there's a lot in there. You see lots of countries that are over-consuming, but there's also a number of countries where there are hundreds and hundreds of millions of persons that still have their basic needs to be met. And we're already talking about crossing thresholds and limited availability of resources. How do we reconcile these tensions? In terms of hotspots, you can already see from just analyzing food where one of our biggest problems is. It shows you very clearly what our dependence on meat is doing to the planet. And look somewhere down at India and what is dependence on a primarily vegetarian diet actually means in terms of the planet. Another one to look at, for example, is transportation, right? We have primarily a car culture. And look at the impact of cars. And those of us that flew in here, that is a bit of an indication of the impact of our modes of transportation, especially, I should insist here, fossil fuel transportation is really a problem we cannot avoid talking about, and we cannot dodge it if we are to find solutions, right? But besides this climate problem, there's also what we have as a very strong inequality problem. At some point during the pandemic, we had billionaires' wealth grow by trillions of dollars, and while tens of millions of families are actually filing for bankruptcy, right? We do know, for example, that the top 10% of the richest in the world are actually responsible for about 50% of these greenhouse gas emissions, which is why you hear a lot about eco-anxiety, especially amongst the youth who are complaining about the lack of opportunities for the future and the uncertainty that surrounds them when they think about future possibilities, right? So, one thing we look at within the report is something called a fair consumption space. And it is how to make sure that our consumption of these resources, the way we live our lives, actually is reconciled with the planetary boundaries. On the one hand, we have an over-consuming population. On the other hand, we have an under-consuming population. The argument within here is there is a very comfortable space within which we can all negotiate our needs on an equitable basis. But that requires that we recognize an ecological ceiling and a social floor, as well as asking people to reduce overconsumption. We need to make sure that those who have not even yet met their needs, or those who are just barely meeting their needs, do not fall below that social floor. So this is the whole idea of a fair consumption space, which brings me to the question, if we're in a climate emergency and we have a vast inequalities and disparities in power, how do we negotiate the remaining budget that we have in a way that is equitable to everyone? This is the question that we try to address in this report that we've done together with UNED on lifestyles in a climate emergency, right? And we talk about choice editing. People easily get scared by this, but this is something that governments have done for a long time. That's why you can't walk in here with a gun. It's the reason why you cannot buy cocaine next door, because you've been choice edited. The point here is governments have traditionally used a particular criteria, in this case, public health, security, and so on, to edit out certain things from availability from public. But if we've now declared a climate emergency, isn't it time that we start using sustainability criteria to actually do this choice editing? So How do we go about this? We have a system overload, and we're talking about shifting to sustainable lifestyles. One way that we need to do this is to edit out the high carbon intensive options for consumption. For example, we have a few here, especially where you have privatized benefits but public burden, or examples of where you have incentives for high consumerism, so your frequent flyer miles, loyalty programs of five-star hotels, your super yachts and private jets, but also we need to start thinking very carefully, how is this problem reflected in our investments, especially when we take basic needs and we put it in a speculative market. Things like housing and food should not be areas where we're investing for profit if we're talking about an emergency, right? The other alternative is not just taking out things, but what else do you bring in? So in this case, it is editing in options that are better for the environment. For example, public transportation, non-animal based diets, and so on. But it's not just editing in and out, it's ensuring that we have equity. There's a more equitable space for consumption for everybody. And how do we ensure this? One example being explored by the Earth for All project is looking at a possibility that we cap that the 10% richest in the country do not own more than 40% of national wealth. That way, there's better distribution and less tension in society, right? So how do we go about, somebody let me know if I have 5 minutes left. How do we go about looking at this? One of the projects that I'm going to, outcomes of a project that we've worked together with Vanessa Timmer from One Earth Canada, with Detlef Van Vuuren from University of Utrecht, with SDS in France, and my colleagues at the Cool Institute, is to try to imagine possible worlds of the future. What does it really look like when you try to envision what future possibilities would look like? As you go through this, do not think of them as predictions. Just think of them as an exercise in trying to see different possibilities and which action you can take and how that action leads you to one preferred world and not the other. So I'm going to present 4 of them, and as you can see, they're all this in one way or another. You can tweak them to lead us to a future. I see lots of cameras here. Please do not circulate this widely. It's not the final version. You're allowed to take pictures, but please do not circulate them too widely. The point here being that you can tweak either one of them to lead to 1.5-degree future. But which one has these elements of equity, has these elements of well-being, and has this element of meeting the Paris targets? So I will try to go through each one of these one by one and really quick to show you a different characteristic and to show you how you can apply choice editing to get to a particular, to each one of these worlds. The first one here is a design world. And the point here is that national governments and businesses have now really come to terms with the idea of limits. And so they've bonded together to pre-design worlds within which we orchestrate our needs. But it's a very fast-paced world. But at the same time, there are very hard measures that need to make sure that we're in keeping with our ecological budget. In this case, we're beginning to talk about ideas such as rationing of energy, as well as being very hard on things like second homes, and second and third homes, or supercars and SUVs and private jets, but as well as providing subsidies to make sure that those that cannot afford it are meeting these needs. The second one here is global commons. And in this case, there's really a rethink of the values that underscore global governance. And instead of growth-oriented extractive economic systems that we know from the past, the Global South is now participating in global governance. We have things like a Global Resources Forum, which is something the EU is exploring now anyway. And things like well-being are at the center of our development, instead of things like the global, like the GDP. And we're talking about strong investments in public transportation, as well as new institutions. Hungary is talking about an ombudsman for future generation. There are countries that are thinking of ministries of climate change. Right. And the third one here is a big village. Think of it as very strengthened communities that within themselves are supporting a much slower but healthier way of living. There's much more participatory governance in here. There's shorter work weeks, for example, and there's a lot of sharing within these communities in recognition of the fact that it has lower per capita intensity in terms of greenhouse gas emissions. The last but not the least is a pocket lifestyle. And here people really, of course, subscribe to the idea of a sustainable lifestyle, but it's very high-tech and peer-to-peer dependent, where you're dependent on smart technologies and sort of large-scale infrastructures like smart grids and so on that allow for more individualized living, but with a certain consciousness. Like I said, any one of these can lead you to 1.5, but under what condition? What do you what do you edit out? What do you edit in? And how do you ensure equity within this? So I will try to go through a few key points that I think whatever world you're thinking about can be very helpful for you to take. The first one here is that we need to create positive visions of what a future society could look like. These positive visions should be inspiring, and they should reflect the versions of the youth, those who are feeling a lot about this eco-anxiety. These visions also do not have to be really ultra technology driven in the sense that they become utopias. And these visions need to be very considerate of these extremes of wealth that we have in society. Instead of just measuring economic growth, we need to see how our well-being is reflected in investments that we're making now and what social tensions are manifesting in these investments. But it's not only people that are in northern countries, people like you and I that can afford to be here. There are indigenous people that have lived with natural systems for a long time, and they've lived happily. We should learn from these people. But there's also historical examples that can teach us how we can charter our ways into the future. Last but not least, one thing to think about very clearly, no matter which world you think of or you prefer, we are going to need large, unprecedented amounts of capacity building for us to transform the systems that we have now. It's not just a capacity for individuals and households, it's also for businesses and national governments. And it's not just a capacity to do things, it's also a capacity to imagine a different future and to accept the radical changes that will be needed to get us to this future. I will leave it at that. I hope I was not too fast, but thank you so much for listening.
Thank you very much, Luis. As you can see, lots of information to be shared, the choice editing, the different scenarios, and the need to do different scaling. So now I want to invite our panelists. So I would like to invite Ulf Jackel, Head of Division of Sustainable Consumption, Product-Related Environmental Protection from the Ministry of Environment, Natural Conservation, Nuclear Safety, and Consumer Production from Germany. So please, Ulf. I'm also very pleased to have with us Sandrine Dixon de Cleve, who is the co-president of the Club de Rome. For health reasons, she could not be here in person, but she will be. Sandrine, thank you very much. I'm so happy that we have you here. And as I was mentioning, and Luis as well, we are also celebrating the 50th anniversary of Limits to Growth, so it's excellent to have you here. Our third panelist, Mylene Peterson-Beckerman, is the Head of Global Sustainability Engagement and Communications of the Inter-IKEA Group. I want to invite also Nathalie Mangodon, who is the Finance Youth Fellow of UNFFF of Climate Champions. So welcome. And Massimo Masocco, the founder of Eco House and youth leader also, the UNDP Youth Champion. So excellent. So now, so you have, please. And Luis, please, you can also come and join us if you want. So we have had an introduction, and Ulf, I would like to start with you. You've been someone that for decades have been working and promoting sustainable consumption and production, consumer information. We've been working a lot on this. So having heard now the presentation from Luis, I would like if you can share with us from the government perspective, Ulf, what are the priority areas for action that government can take to enable this rapid transition to more sustainable lifestyles?
Yeah, thank you very much, Adriana, and thank you, Luis, for this very good analysis of the situation we have. Yeah, indeed, there is it's an urgent need to do something, and of course, governments have a huge task in enabling sustainable lifestyles. That's for sure. I mean, we have to set the frame also according to our targets. I mean, we have set targets. For example, in Germany, we have set the target of climate neutrality. We have set the targets in particular on consumption, that we want to halve the per capita greenhouse gas emissions by 2030. So this is something, if you remember the graph with the greenhouse gas emissions per capita, there we are at 9 about that. So Great Britain, somewhere that between Great Britain and Finland. So it's an enormous effort we have to undertake. One of the priority areas is, of course, the infrastructure. Electricity grid, for example, that people cannot change by themselves. We have to change it from the government side. We have to see that the renewables are the share of renewables is a very large one. That's definitely is our task. And things like waste management, which is also very important, also in relation to climate change. And of course, we have to do education. Raising awareness is a tremendous effort, and it's also a public task, and it's absolutely needed that the awareness and the knowledge is there that sustainable choices can be made. Otherwise, it's not possible. If you think of priority areas, of course, housing is here in this in Northern Europe, insulation things. This is needed, and highly efficient heating. And in other parts of the world, highly efficient cooling. There are huge differences. And for example, the potential to reduce greenhouse gases just via air conditioning. It's that if you use the right air conditioners, you could save 1.5 times the greenhouse gas emissions of Germany. So there's a huge potential in that. Mobility, you named it, Louis. Incentives for no or low carbon mobility. But also there, you have to set incentives that this is done. You have to set up the infrastructure there, charging stations, these kind of things. Here in Stockholm, we are quite advanced, I would say. If you look at most cities in Germany, we are not that quite advanced. The same with bicycle lanes or providing space for different types of modality. Parking lots instead of green areas. So these kind of things, of course, this has to be thought anew. I mean, the policy was different the last 50 years.
Exactly.
Food, of course, ensuring information. Target 12.8 is a very important one also in that regard. Ensuring information by 2030. And of course, prevent greenwashing, which happens.
Yeah. Thanks, Ulf.
A lot. But let me conclude by saying, okay, yes, governments have to do, but they cannot do that alone. The implementation has come by business, by, of course, also by the consumers.
Exactly, and the government might be putting the regulatory framework or incentives for these priority sectors. And so given the climate emergency that we are here, and as we have heard on this need for choice editing, Ulf, in your perspective, how could governments use this choice editing, either editing in or out, to accelerate and avoiding, of course, backlashes that sometimes...
Yeah. Yeah, choice editing is needed. I mean, it's very unpopular for politicians to tell people not to consume something, and the experience, for example, with the phasing out of light bulbs we had in the European Union, this uproar why people cannot have their inefficient light bulbs anymore. Yeah. So, but it's a quite natural reaction. So we have to do that, set minimum requirement standards. We do that with the Eco-Design Directive, for example, in the European Union, and that approach will be developed further with the Sustainable Product Initiative and the new Eco-Design a regulation we will have. We will look at the whole life cycle. We will not only look at electronic appliances, we look at areas like textiles, for example, where it's definitely lean. It is Wild West at the moment in the field of textiles. There is no regulation at all, nowhere in the world, more or less. So these kind of issues have to be addressed. And of course, yes, Louis, you are right. We have to provide incentives for the champions via type 1 eco-labeling, like the Nordic Swan here, or by via sustainable public procurement. We have to do that. That's also our task. So yes, we have to do a lot. We are working on that.
Yeah, you are. And I think you also mentioned before one example on the mobility, the fact that in Germany or other countries there's more public parking or more bicycle lines. That's editing in, no? There's enabling conditions for that. So thanks a lot. So I would like now to invite Sandrine Dixon de Cleve. I'm very pleased you are here. Thank you for being with us. And again, also I want to congratulate also for the 50th anniversary of the very important publication Limits to Growth. And I know you have a new one that is going to be launched, and I'm sure you will tell us about it. So I would like to hear from you, how can consumption and values underscore a new development paradigm for a more sustainable development? And how do you see all this narrative developing after the publication of Limits to Growth?
Thank you for that question. And it is the question, because I think that what we really haven't heard enough from the last speaker, and I fully understand why, because governments have to figure out which particular tools they can focus on in the toolbox. I'd like to take a step back first and remind everyone that when the Limits to Growth came out in 1972, there already were predictions, and the scenarios demonstrated that we were going to be far beyond the planetary boundaries, and we'd have a series of crises. And so we're in the midst of those crises. And so I think that if we're looking at a new development paradigm for today, first we have to realize that we have to create that in the midst of crisis. And when you create things in the midst of crisis, unfortunately, often we have short-term knee-jerk reactions. So the first point is, as we are here in the midst of what I call the 3 C's, so climate, COVID, and conflict on our doorstep, we have to think through, well, what are the systemic shifts that are needed right now, the short-term levers? Well, we can already look at overconsumption as one of the key major problems with regard to fossil energy. Why not focus on demand rather than focusing on supply? We have seen the knee-jerk reaction of going back to LNG and natural gas coming from other supplies. What we should be doing is putting a major overhaul right now in our infrastructure, as was said from the last speaker, and ensuring that we actually have the right infrastructure to support renewables, but also to support energy efficiency and a shift in our demand, because demand is never sexy enough. The next key point is, what do we do about our food supply? Again, overconsumption in terms of food and dependencies, because actually we are not looking at regenerative local production for local consumption, and instead are so dependent on products that are coming from outside that actually our value chains, once they are disrupted, create massive issues in terms of pricing and in terms of increased poverty for certain people. So I would like us to take a step back and think a bit more deeply around how we shift our economic and financial models. We have to think about first moving beyond GDP. And that was something that actually Louis mentioned, which is very near and dear to our heart at the Club of Rome and my heart here, and also the New Earth for All project that we've just launched, which is we have to put in place new indicators to growth. Interestingly enough, it is those economies that actually are called the well-being economies that have put in more resilience in their economies by looking at environmental, economic, and social indicators that have done better during COVID than others. It is also, by the way, those companies that have looked at environmental, social, and governance factors that have actually done better also during COVID, and probably will be doing better through this conflict issue. So what we need to think about is, how do we then change those indicators across the board in more countries and in more companies, and demonstrate that actually it will make companies more resilient because they will be resilient to future shocks and stresses, and also countries. It also, however, means that we need to think a little bit more around what are the different types of impacts that could happen to our neighbors or those that we are trading with, our partners. If we stop consumption, if we really try to reduce the way in which we consume, and by the way, I'd just like to add that we should tap into the subconsciousness of most people post-COVID who realized during COVID the most important essential factors were actually access to medical care, access to hospitals and social services, access also to food, to water, to energy, to the basic access that they needed in order to survive. And I think tapping into that type of essential aspect of our lives and livelihoods is fundamental as we try to shift our economies. So for me, this is going to take some brave leadership at a time when actually we realize that we're in the midst of this crisis. And it's hard to change when you're in crisis. But it's also, I think, easier to point to the fact that we did transform during COVID, for good or for bad. We did change some of our consumption patterns, although now, unfortunately, we're seeing that the same patterns are coming back up. And I think we can tap into that consciousness of people. Maybe one last point, which is that we've just done a survey through our Earth for All project and also in working with many other organizations. And we've actually seen that 75% of G20 citizens that were surveyed want to move towards a well-being economy. The same percent believe that climate change is really the greatest crisis ever. So we need to tap into that consciousness and really start to put in place the right levers now for change.
Excellent, Sandrine. Thank you very much for this. And to, you say very important things. They need to focus more on the demand. They need to look at new metrics. And I also like what you say, we should not forget the good lessons learned from COVID because, and sadly, yeah, I hope we don't go back to that. We shouldn't go back to that. But in this, and I want to highlight, in the way to Stockholm+50, we were doing 5 regional consultations. And you will be happy to hear that one of the common messages that we hear in the 5 regions is the need for new metrics going beyond GDP. So let me go to the second question to you. And given that really this is what is coming, we need these new metrics. So, and you mentioned that. In your view, what are those new metrics that we need, or the new indicators or improved indicators that we will need to include so that we can track progress for a healthier planet and better well-being?
So actually, as we've been saying, we should put in place the well-being indicators, or you can even think about donut economy indicators, those that are coming back to placing a value on education, placing a value, obviously, on social services and Medicare, placing a value also on ensuring that actually nature is taken into consideration across all budgets, as well as decarbonization. So the environmental social impacts that we're seeing right now and building that resilience within our economies by making sure that we have indicators in place that truly do place a value on these very important aspects. But it also means that we need to think around how do we start to penalize what isn't good. So it means making sure that we shift subsidies, making sure that we tax the bads and actually give a subsidy to the goods. It also means that we need to think much more clearly about what does the future look like for people and the way in which they are part of the economy. The parallel economy, for example, that is often not taken care of and is run very much by women, empowering women. In fact, if you look at the way in which we've addressed this through our 5 turnarounds in Earth for All, we've said that you need to put indicators in place that address poverty, that address inequity, and that address empowerment of women. And that also will enable us to then do the right thing in terms of energy and also in terms of food. Because we don't want to have another big crisis around, for example, the yellow vests, where people are in the streets blocking the functioning of the economy because they feel that they have been unjustly taxed because of a high diesel tax, for example. So it is trying to bring in these indicators. And we have so many good examples now. In fact, at the European Union, we will be launching a project directly, the Club of Rome, with DG Research and Innovation and the European Environment Agency, and are also working with other DGs to look at some of the indicators that they have already started to put in place to see how, at the European level, we can start to shift from a GDP-driven economy to a well-being-driven economy. And we will have in 2 weeks a huge hearing actually inside the European Parliament to discuss some of this. So this is real. And I think that's also what's very exciting. There are a series of different dashboards of indicators, like the EU Resilience Dashboard, and that's developing very well. As I said, there's the well-being government indicators. There are We All indicators, which have been put forward also by an organization that brings together actually a series of different organizations from across the globe that I'm an ambassador of. So we're not short of indicators.
Yeah.
I think the key is how do we shift from the current GDP-driven indicator and put in place the right indicators for 21st century economics.
Excellent. Yeah, and we hope really that this will be one of the key messages that come out from Stockholm+50. And as I say, this was very clear from the regional consultations. And I'm glad also that you mentioned the need of vision of future, the need of poverty, equality, empowerment of women. And in this, what a better introduction for Natalie Mangono. I'm very happy you are here as a youth activist. You are also working on finance for climate. And Natalie, I would like now to invite you, based on all the conversation you have heard, how does sustainable living look like in Africa, in the global south, in the countries that you've been working? And so what's the role of youth and also the role of finance in supporting this sustainable living in the global south?
Yeah, so I'm so happy that Lewis mentioned that statistic that the richest 10% are responsible for over 50% of overall emissions. But I think a more interesting statistic that came out of that report was that the richest 1% are responsible for more than double of the poorest half of the world. And so we're not necessarily living sustainably, we're living for survival a lot of the time. And so you have a case in which we need to actually be increasing our consumption, increasing our production. So we can't really edit out increasing our consumption, but we can do it in a way that, is sustainable as we're increasing our consumption and our production, because we don't only face recovery from the COVID-19 pandemic or climate change, we have other struggles that we're going through, whether it's being burdened by debt in Africa particularly, or, various other things. So I think the role of the youth is, multifaceted. There's a role for every type of youth in addressing this crisis. This includes advocacy, this includes at a policy level, and this includes getting funding for young people, because oftentimes there's very stringent funding requirements, and you've seen a lot of funding commitments, but you're not seeing it flow to the most vulnerable, to the people who need it most. You have this rich, wealthy minority fueling the climate crisis, and then you have us as youth and us living in the developing world facing the impacts of that and with the least resources to respond to it. So it's changing our financial systems in a way that is appropriate. We can make these commitments, but how do we match them with what's happening on the ground? How do we meet people where they are, whether it's in the developing world, whether it's young people who might not have the various paperwork, the various, the long time of experience and networks to be accessing those finance? How do we create financial instruments that are appropriate? And I think that's something that we've really been working on.
And can you share with us, Natalie, examples of, in your work now with the financing climate, examples that you think are working in the southern, in the global south on
Yeah.
finance?
Yeah, so we're working, another thing you can't edit out is food, but you can change the way in which the systems operate. So we're working on a transformative finance initiative for food systems within Africa, and it focuses on, as Sandrine says, strengthening the local value chains to ensure that we can have regenerative agricultural approaches, and that really has positive implications for both mitigation, adaptation, and building resilience of communities. And so oftentimes you see that private sector capital isn't attracted to agricultural and food systems within Africa. I think it receives about 0.2% of climate-related finance. And, as I said, everyone has to eat. So it doesn't make sense why it's receiving so little. Well, according to them, the projects are often not of a maturity, of an appropriate size. They're not scalable and able to be replicated. And so that's what us as the champions are doing. We're trying to convene, converge, and catalyze Africa's food systems and agricultural production so that we can increase consumption in a way that is both climate resilient and doesn't end up increasing emissions as well.
Excellent. That's a good example. And yeah, we need to scale up the capacity so that they can have more access to finance. So let's move now to the private sector perspective. I'm glad to have Malin Pettersson-Beckman from us with us. So Malin, how is it from the business perspective, and how can business drive demand for sustainable products and services? Can you give us examples from IKEA?
Yes, thank you so much for inviting us, and also to my fellow panelists for such interesting and valuable perspectives. And our starting point is that sustainable living can't be a luxury for a few people. From our research, we know that most people actually want to live more sustainable lives, but one of the main barriers is that it's perceived to be too expensive and too difficult. So businesses like IKEA, of course, can play a big role here. And IKEA, as a home furnishing business, touching millions of people around the world, we have one of our biggest opportunities, and of course also a responsibility, to make sustainable living accessible, affordable, and desirable for the many people. I mean, we believe that it simply should be the default option. And this is a global ambition. And it needs to be a holistic approach, so including everything from the design of our products for circular capabilities, to resource use, to our impact on climate change and biodiversity, but also to how our products are being used, reused, and eventually taken care of at end of life. And it's of course also how we engage with customers, and how we meet our customers, and we need to look critically at what we sell and how we sell, and also how we use our insights in life at home to inspire more sustainable lifestyles and enabling people to adopt more circular behaviors. And for example, we're looking at 5 areas where our products and services can have a direct impact on people's ability to reduce their environmental footprint at home. And that's energy, water, air, waste, and food. And just let me give you some examples. So since 2015, we only have LED bulbs in our range. And last year, we introduced our next generation of LED bulbs, which is even more affordable and 35% more energy efficient than previous LED bulbs. So that enables customers to save money and energy. Another example is the launch of air purifiers, enabling people to purify their air in their homes. Air pollution is a major health risk. And IKEA is also one of the big food providers. So here we have a unique opportunity to make a positive difference by introducing more plant-based alternatives. And our ambition is that actually 50% of the main meals offered in our restaurants should be plant-based. And we have developed now, we have recreated the famous iconic meatball and introduced a plant ball version, which ingredients only have 4% of the climate footprint compared to the ingredients of the traditional meatball. And it has been so well received by our customers. And I think it's because we have worked really hard to make it as tasty and affordable as the traditional meatball. And this is key to make it delicious. And then we are also, of course, trying to inspire our customers to adopt more circular behaviors by inspiring them to care for and repair products in more ways, making spare parts more available, making it easier to order them, testing different services for buyback and for second-hand shops. And this has also been very well received, and we need to find scalable solutions. But overall, we need to meet people where they are, and we as a home furnishing business can't really point fingers and tell people how they should live their lives. It has to be inspiring, it has to be accessible. I stop there. And affordable.
Excellent. And it's like editing, bringing new desirable solutions. So, and I also know IKEA has started this exercise on systemic shifting and circular product assessment. So, based on that experience, in your view, what are those necessary conditions to scale this up? Because, well, IKEA is doing this, but how can we make that others will also follow you?
Yeah, absolutely. So we have assessed more than 9,500 products in the IKEA range for their circular capabilities. And first of all, one positive insight is that all product types, from big bulky sofas to smaller decorative products, have the potential to have circular capabilities. And then two other insights is that the importance of designing for standardization and adaptability from the very beginning, and that in turn enables more scalable maintenance solutions. So using standardized spare parts or reusing parts from other products in new products. And another learning is the importance of choosing the right material from the very beginning to avoid waste throughout the process, and also facilitating the recycling process in the end. And I mean, one example is the quite familiar, perhaps, Ivar storage system, which is made of wood, so it's a renewable material. It's easier to repair and retain. It's modular, so you can build onto it, and you can perhaps use it in, your first dorm or apartment, and then you can use it in other parts of your home. And we have other examples of those modular products. And now we have made the insights and the method of this circular assessment available through an online interactive product assessment tool. So anyone actually outside IKEA can assess their home furnishing products to see how circular they are. And we have also made our circular design principles available, and this is of course one way of sharing the learnings we have gained so far to inspire and accelerate the transition to a more circular economy.
Excellent, that's great.
And some of the preconditions just on that, I mean, we need common definitions on repairability, reusability, and so that we all move in the same direction and have a common reference point. We also need an infrastructure in place that enables better waste handling and collecting furniture, and also makes it much more convenient for customers and people to pass on products. Because even if we design products or furniture with circular capabilities, if they end up in landfill, we have failed. So here we really need to work together, and we depend on a societal shift to a circular economy and need to work together, like many have said, I think, during all panels these days.
And I love that, because exactly that's what we are saying. If we are just saying business has to do it, and if business becomes to be circular, but then consumers are not bringing the things to be repaired, the things that can be repaired, so we don't do it. And that's why we are always saying for the circularity, behavior change is very important, on the focus on demand that Sandrine was mentioning. So this is perfect to move now to Massimo. I'm glad you are here. Massimo is the founder of a very interesting initiative in Latin America on Eco House. So, Massimo, I would like first to invite you just to give a few reactions on all what you have heard, and in particular on the role of youth. We always say youth is the future. I think you are the present. And also, if you can share with us inspiring initiatives that you see youth is already implementing in moving towards more sustainable living within 1.5. So over to you.
Okay, thank you very much for inviting. When I was 17 years old, I was studying economics in the university, and someone told me, "Hey, have you read the report Limits of Growth?" No. And in my first year, I read that book, and that made me change the career to environmental science. So I just want to say hi and thank you very much. But not only for the Club of Rome, for everyone that worked during the past couple of decades, because youth, the environmental movement, the sustainability movement, social environmental movement, it didn't start with us in these last couple of years. We stand on the shoulder of giants all the time. We are not inventing the wheel. We are just trying to accelerate what, for many of us, it's obvious because information is there. When Lewis told us this report, it's like, it's there. We need to do something. We need to act upon that. So as youth and our organizations, we work with more than 100 organizations, really hard because it's difficult to work with so many differences and cultures. We have some conclusions, and we realize that something that also happened in our history, when we face a crisis, we need a revolution. In such a crisis, we need literally an equal or bigger revolution to change it. So I take that part when our colleague here finished his keynotes of we need a radically change. And not only in governments and business, but in ourselves as people, as citizens, because we are the ones that consume the products. Every product that we have here, that I have, this cell phone, comes from ecocide, comes from ecological and environmental climate crisis. And something very important to understand from the Global South is that tackling climate change not involves obligatory climate justice, social justice. It's not that if we reduce the carbon footprint, we are going to have a more equality society. The revolution needs to involve every part of the system. That's something that we always want to say. That's why we started with many projects and initiatives. I can tell you one, also taking what our colleague here said from the government. Education, sometimes in this emergency, is left out a little bit. It's like, okay, we need to act right now. And towards where is the question? Because we are 8 billion people, very different, very different. The only thing we have in common is diversity. So to start with, we have different ideas, ways of doing things, and each country has their own rules. For example, we were just saying, okay, we need to edit. Perfect. In Argentina, we edit with a native forest law since many years ago. The native forest law never had the budget, never, always 2% of the budget needed. Why? Because the system of production in our country, where half population is poor, we need to understand this, it's to expand the frontier, agriculture frontier. So when the system says, okay, we need to, yes, deforestate. That's how it works in our country. So it's not like we only change some stuff and everything is going from one day to another to be different. We are in a transition. We have the emergency, but we are in a transition. That's why one of our projects, just to give an example, that youth can work together and can do a huge impact every day if we have more resources and we have more space and we have a seat in the big tables and we can talk each other intergenerationally and say what we think. We have a project in Eco House. I'm just going to say from my organization, but I could speak of many, that is called the School Networks of Sustainable Development. We started with 1, with 2, with 3. Now we have thousands in Latin America and the Caribbean. We work not with children and students only. We work with capacitate and leave the teachers capacitate in sustainable development. And again, it's not only climate change. It's not the same only in our country that is very big. I don't know if you know Argentina, it's very large. Only in our country, it's totally different to talk to someone and teach someone about sustainable development in the south, Ushuaia, the southest place in the world, where it's very cold, than in the north. That is totally different. The weather, the culture, how do we do things, what we produce. So youth has a lot of initiatives. We have very little time, but what I would like to say to everyone that is listening, with my humble opinion, is that please invest in the new generations, because we are inheriting, we understood the limits of growth, we understood, and we are millions right now. The pandemic for us, it was really hard. But, for example, in America and Latina, just to see like the good side, we connected through the technology as never as youth. And we grew in movements, we grew in networks, we grew in projects. We had time to sit down a little bit, see 3, 4 documentaries about climate change and say, hey, what's going on? Because if not, in the daily basis, you don't have time. Sometimes some people started doing yoga. It changed a lot of stuff because we stopped a little bit. I'm not saying that I'm okay with the pandemic, but I'm just trying to see the good side.
There were positive things that
positive things, and afterwards we know. In these couple of years, how it's growing the movement, even in companies.
I will need to
sorry.
you.
Stop.
Maximo is also from Latin America as me, and you
speak a
know
lot.
we love talking. But he's
That's
saying fantastic things, and I really like what you're saying. You're standing on the shoulders of giants. I like this, Maximo, what you're saying, the radical changes and investing in the present and future generations, I will say. So thanks, and also what we have in common is diversity. We are going to open the floor for questions, but before this, I really want to invite Emanuela Cinta, who is here with us. She's an indigenous leader from Dakar, and also an activist and filmmaker, has been working with indigenous people. And the reason I want to invite her, and please, if you want to join us here, is, maybe she can sit here. You say something important, and it's the different narratives that we need to hear. There's not only one pathway, there are different pathways. And Emanuela, you were with us, and I want to say during the regional consultation, something that was very important also, Sandrine, was the voices of indigenous people and the need to say we need to bring different narratives. There are different pathways, and there are also the importance of including the indigenous people. So, Emanuela, so after listening to this and also our consultation in Asia Pacific, I would like just to invite you to just share with us some of your takeaways or comments.
Sure. Yes, of course, I wrote some notes here from the presentations of the speakers, and I would like to thank you for amazing presentations because it's really inspiring, and all that you say is true. That's right, that's correct, and that's what we need right now. Because if we talk about sustainable lifestyle, I think it has been a hot topic, like for decades. I mean, like we cannot leave it when we have this like forum or international meetings about environment. We always have to talk about sustainable lifestyles. But the questions now is, what is our personal motivations to achieve, or what makes us want to live a sustainable lifestyle? This is the question for each of us. Is it really to, like, let's say, save this planet, save this only one Earth? Or maybe we want to support the global economy? Or maybe we just want to simply, save money? I don't know. But it's true that you say that sustainable lifestyle sometimes it's expensive. And I don't know why, because we as a Dayak live in Borneo Island, we don't think it's expensive because of the amount of the money. It's expensive. Well, not expensive, it's priceless because of the respect, self control, and the spiritual connections that we have with the nature, with forests, with water, with soil. That's all that we have when we are living our lives. That's what makes sustainable lifestyle priceless, not only expensive, priceless. So, yeah. Um, I think we really need to highlight and emphasize what other speakers also said. We need to change because nothing will change unless you and I change. Because maybe we are the cause of the problems, let's say our behavior cause of all these problems, but also our decision today can be a solution. So I want to say today is the day of decisions for us. I mean, for our generations, even like in our country, yeah, our country still prefer 16 millions of palm oil plantations over the lush forests that provide you with clean water and oxygen and so on. So this is the homework for us. When we leave this room, let's decide what we are going to do. Let's do the next right thing.
Thank,
Adil Catalino bacalumin kasuruga besaringat kajubata. Tabe.
thank you very much. Thanks, Emanuela. We have 5 minutes to close. We don't want to keep you so long. So I just want to say, is there any burning question? Yes, please. And let me just give you the mic.
You can hear from an old timer. I've been at this for a very long time. I'm Michael Wadley. I'm the Oscar-winning director of Woodstock. I'm also a scientist, a doctor, and so on. I would make two observations. Let's go back to the opening that you mentioned. We can do massive harm through two things, ignorance and indifference. From a scientific perspective, we've got to be accurate. We can't afford to have the ignorance out there. And from an indifference point of view, there's one group of people who set the standards for the world, and that's really the ultra-high developed people, including Swedish and Norwegian, North American, Canada, and so forth. So it's most important that we deal with the indifference of those people, of the electorate of Sweden, of the electorate of the Americans, and so forth. And that means that we have to accurately inform them about what they're doing. And that's been very difficult because, for example, the IPCC cannot give out national data. That's the agreement that they've made with governments. So I think it's very important for all of the groups, all these good groups that you have here, to tell the truth, to fight that indifference, but start at the top. Start with the real influencers that are right here in Northern Europe and North America. They're the most important people.
Thank you. Thank you. And yeah, respect the differences. Perfect. Any other question before? Thanks. Thanks, Luis. We have two questions there.
The question is for you. My name is Federica Marchionni from Global Fest on Agenda. Luis, what is the criteria for choosing the countries that you choose before when you presented your slides? And very interesting conversation and panel. Thank you all.
Is there any other question? We can take them and then I give you the floor.
Great. Vanessa Timmer from One Earth. I'd like to ask Sandrine, you were talking about the informal economy, the care economy, and I just wonder if you could speak a little bit more about how that would shape our future sustainable ways of living.
Perfect. And the last question, thanks.
I think we don't have time.
Yeah.
All right, to quickly answer your question, most of the countries, they're part of the G20. Not all of them, but most of them are part of the G20. And this is the group of highest consuming economies in the world. But we also wanted to have a mix of countries from industrialized and industrializing countries to give a sort of broad perspective of what is happening globally.
Great. Sandrine, you want to answer the question? Very briefly, it has to be like.
Yeah, well, first of all, isn't it sad that we call it the informal economy? Because actually these women are what drive many economies and in particular communities. So I think, first of all, we need to empower women who are supposedly part of the informal economy and bring them back into the economy. We can do that by putting in place the right indicators, social indicators, in order to enable that to happen. I think the other key point is that in our decision-making processes, we need to give much more time and energy to the role that women play in our economies and also Indigenous people. And I so agree with what has been said around the need to respect diversity. We are facing the greatest complexity we have ever faced and the greatest crises. And if we don't tap into that diversity, which is our union, I fully agree with Maximo, thank you, then I don't think we're going to make it. So let's respect the different parts of our economies. I mean, let's not forget that the future of work is totally shifting because of COVID and will shift also because of climate change. So we are going to have to completely rethink the way in which our economy is going to be the driver. And for that, we also are going to have to think about universal basic dividends and citizen funds and other mechanisms to ensure people's lives and livelihoods are continued to be maintained.
Excellent. Thank you very much. So we need to close here. I want to thank you all very much. We are here if there are more questions with the panelists. And just to conclude, I would like to say, like, together, GO4SDGs, UNEP, Cool Institute, we will continue this conversation. I'm very happy to announce that what we want to do now is to start these dialogues of the different pathways, because it's plural pathways that we can have for sustainable living. So we want to start working at the city level. The other good thing is to say we are launching the Youth Academy for Sustainable Living. So it's in different regions. We are doing now online training also on sustainable lifestyles to understand better the concept. And we just launched also a few weeks ago the policy brief on sustainable living choice editing. And of course, we will continue working with governments, private sector in really making this shift. And you say the world is changing and we need to think out of the box and reinvent, really reimagine the future we want. So with this, thank you to all very much and big applause, and the work has to continue.
Thank you. Thank you.